The Himalayas have long been an area which have attracted famous travellers, explorers and anthropologists. And among these, one remembers the names of Francis Hamilton, Brian Hodgson, Joseph Hooker, Sven Hedin, J.H. Hutton. And perhaps the last of this great series of explorers and anthropologists, all curiously beginning with the letter H, is Professor Christoph von Fürer-Haimendorf, the Emeritus Professor of Asian Anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And I would now like to introduce Professor Haimendorf and to talk to him in the following minutes about his work and life in India and in Nepal. Professor Haimendorf, you were born in 1909 in Vienna, and you went to university in Vienna. I wondered what courses you did at Vienna.
In the University of Vienna, the courses in anthropology are fairly comprehensive. Namely, one doesn't only study anthropology, you also, which is there, was then called ethnology, but also you have to take other subjects. So I did archaeology and also physical anthropology. It's quite useful afterwards if you have some idea about these neighboring disciplines. And people ask me often, we were in Vienna, I mean, was then, Austria, which had become small, it was not a colonial power. Why were you so interested in doing anthropology? Actually, I got to anthropology through India. As a schoolboy at the age of 15, 16, I got very interested in India. I read Tagore, I read about Gandhi and so on. So I thought, well, if I take anthropology, I might have the chance once to go to India. So it really is, India was the first interest, and from that I got onto anthropology.
That's exactly the question in my mind. Which were the people who influenced you most during your courses?
Well, the anthropology in Vienna at the time was under the influence of what was called the Kulturkreislehre. I mean, the theory about the circles of different cultures. There's no good English translation of Kulturkreislehre. And the two figures who were there most interested was Professor Wilhelm Schmidt, who is a great linguist, and I think now, but perhaps more known for his linguistic work. And then there was the head of the Institute of Völkerkunde, Institute of Ethnology, as one would translate it, who was Professor Koppers. But apart from these two, there was also Professor Heine Geldern, and he had perhaps the most lasting influence on me, because he was mainly interested in Southeast Asia, and he was a great archaeologist. He had done hardly any anthropological fieldwork, but he was very well known for his archaeological work. And I think it was due to Heine Geldern that ultimately I chose the extreme northeast of India for my first field work, namely the Naga Hills. I think without Heine Geldern, I perhaps wouldn't have come to this particular area, which I found then afterwards extremely rewarding.
You did a doctoral thesis at Vienna. What was the subject of that thesis?
Yes, that also had something to do with that area. It was a comparative study of hill tribes in Assam and Burma, and with the main kind of interest in their social organization, political organization, etc. Now, that would, to a present-day British academic audience, sounds strange that you write about people whom you have not seen, because by that time I had not been to India or Southeast Asia. But the Austria of the interwar years between the two great wars was then very short of funds for field work. And so people usually did their doctorate first, and if they were successful in that, they then managed perhaps to get funds. So I went through the literature on these tribes. So when I then finally got there, I really knew quite a lot about them. That was the one advantage. And there was also one other interesting, which might be interesting, feature in, you asked me before about the courses in anthropology, is that it was a very kind of wide coverage, which is not very common nowadays anymore. Namely, you didn't from the beginning only deal with India or only deal with Africa. You had to have a sort of broad knowledge of the whole world, more or less. I mean, you had now and then a course of lectures on South America, on North America, on Africa, and so on. So you perhaps didn't know as much as a student in a British university might know about his particular field, like Africa, but one had a very wide view and could probably then choose your area with the idea that that is what interests me most. There are other possibilities too, but that would be the most interesting. And I think it was in this way that I approached Southeast Asia and hills of Assam and finally the Nagas. At that time I also wasted a lot of time once in 2 years in trying to learn Chinese, because Heine Gelden thought then one could also read the Chinese literature on Southeast Asia. That was, of course, was a hopeless thing, because you can't just do Chinese in addition to anthropology.
Was that during the time that you were a University of Vienna research assistant?
Yes, that was at that time.
That was between 1931 and 1934?
Yes.
Then you did finally receive some research funds to go to India. Who funded you?
I got that from the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation at that time gave funds to countries which had been badly hit by the war beforehand, which were short of funds, and consequently University of Vienna got some Rockefeller funds. And that enabled me first to come to England for some time, because the Rockefeller Foundation rightly thought that people should have a wider view of university studies on the area with which they would be dealing. So I was given the choice where to go. I think the university, the Rockefeller Foundation, they expected me to say Harvard or Yale or Berkeley perhaps, but I thought, no, if I want to go to India, I must go to London, which was quite correct, of course. So I came to London and I spent 2 terms at the London School of Economics and joined the famous seminar of Professor Bronislaw Malinowski.
What was that seminar?
That was the sort of general postgraduate, I had already my doctorate then, kind of postgraduate seminar, and that was in 1935 and 1936, the autumn term and the spring term. And so I met there most of the anthropologists really, or future anthropologists of Britain, like Raymond Firth and Barry Ford, I think, was there too, and quite a number of Audrey Richards and Chapera. So by the time many years later, I came back to London, to the university, I had a lot of contacts already.
And then after London, you set off for India. You went first, you sailed by boat, the Victoria, and then you went to India and you first stayed at the Viceregal Lodge with Lord Linlithgow. That must have been an interesting experience.
It was a very interesting and extremely lucky incident, really. And if I may be a bit frivolous over that, it was due to a friendship I had before I left in London with a young girl whom I had met at a ball at the Austrian embassy. And she happened to be a friend of the Linlithgows. And when I said that I was going to India, she said, "Oh, I've got friends that are going too. The father is going as viceroy, so I'm sure they would put you up." So I had the great advantage, which in India, which at that time was obviously extremely conservative, and it was very necessary you had to have the right connections. So I at once started with being known as a friend of the viceroy.
Well, that got you a certain way. You then went on by train to Assam, which is where you were going to work, and you travelled to meet someone who was going to have a great influence on you. That was the district commissioner, Mills, at Kohima. Could you say anything about Mills, who would later have a great influence on you?
Well, that was another lucky incident, namely that at the time when I was in London, J.P. Mills, Philip Mills, he was on leave in London, so somebody put me in touch with him, and we got on very well, and he told me both about what I would find in the Naga Hills and promised to help. And again, that was immensely valuable, because Mills was at that time Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills district, and had worked among the Nagas already for many years, had written 2 books, the Ao Nagas and the Lota Nagas. He was just, his 3rd book was coming out at that time. I remember he showed me the proofs. He was an absolutely charming person and quite a scholar, and also a great friend of the Nagas and a very good administrator. He had been in Naga Hills already as a junior officer. He was subdivisional officer in Mokochung when Hutton, who later became professor of anthropology in Cambridge, J.H. Hutton, was deputy commissioner in Kohima. So there were these 2 British officers who both had a great interest in anthropology, and they worked together. I'm always annoyed now when I see films like film on Gandhi, that, and also other films, where the British officers are described as extremely unsympathetic and stiff and rigid in their views. I must say this is totally different from what I have experienced, not only in Assam, in other parts of India too. I thought that among the Indian civil service, there were so many people who were scholarly, who were most sympathetic to Indians, and who had made really a great contribution, not only to the administration of India, but also to our knowledge of India. I mean, what these ICS officers wrote and published is far more than what many of their Indian colleagues did.
Yes, I was going to ask you about others like Grigson and so on later. But you arrived at Kohima, and Mills immediately swept you off on a 2-week tour with him. This was your first arrival, having come from Vienna and the London School of Economics in the field, among a people who you later described as the naked Nagas, people entirely different. I wondered if you could just say something about your first, if you recall your first reactions in arriving in Nagaland.
Well, it was a very great experience. I mean, having always read about people and written about them even from a basis of lack of knowledge, really, because I had never seen any Nagas, and then suddenly you were thrown into them. it was very lucky that I did that first tour with Mills, who could tell me so many things which otherwise would take a long time to find out. The great problem, of course, from the very beginning was language. I had tried to learn a little Assamese then at the School of Oriental Studies, which already existed while I was at LSE, but I had not been very successful there. And so when I came to Nagas, I had really no language which was very useful. But I was young still, and when one is young, one picks up languages relatively easy. So I engaged a young Naga who had some English. And within about a few months, I managed to speak that kind of lingua franca, which is a kind of pidgin Assamese, which is now still the only language in which the various Naga tribes can communicate with each other, because they all have different languages, mutually not understandable Tibeto-Burman languages. So I managed among the Nagas to acquire enough of that language so that after 4 or 5 months, I didn't need very much any translator, except for particularly difficult subjects. But the experience to be in the field, of course, was extremely pleasant. And also, I had the great fortune being with Mills, who had all the sort of arrangements. I mean, I didn't have the difficulty of finding out how does one get food and how does one get somebody to cook it for you and all these things, because I was at once introduced into the kind of style of life of district officers. And district officers then were very different from what they are now, because they walked on foot. I mean, there were no motor roads, and they walked on foot, or sometimes they might have used the pony. Now, of course, Indian district officers have jeeps, and so they rush from their headquarters to some villages, arrive, talk for an hour or two to the villages, and in a cloud of dust they disappear again. So they haven't that close contact with the old colonial British officers had. And that actually, I think, makes a great difference to the whole administration as it was and as it is now.
Can I ask you again about the language? You learnt, as you say, pidgin Assamese. Did the other district officers, did Hodgson and Mills speak Naga?
They spoke absolutely fluent. This what is now called Nagamese, namely it is an Assamese adapted to Nagas. They learned also some of the dialects of the Nagas, and I think Hutton, for instance, I think was quite fluent in one of them. But on the whole, as the Nagas talked to each other in that pidgin Assamese, it was for a district officer who in any case had to deal with different tribes, I think adequate to have this lingua franca.
You yourself decided to work with one specific group of Nagas. Which one did you choose, and why did you choose that one?
These were the Konyak Nagas. They seemed to be the most interesting because they had not been under British administration for very long. Only a small group of villages were under administration at that time, and those were the ones where I could go. They were virtually unknown. Very little had been written about them. There was one tour diary by Hutton. He had once visited some cognac villages. Otherwise, nothing was known. The main large types, as Angami Nagas and Sema Nagas, Ao Nagas, they had all been described in a series of monographs, which are still classics nowadays, mainly by Hutton and Mills. So I didn't want to go to a tribe which had already been studied. So I chose the cognacs. I was very lucky because they were extremely interesting and they were also very attractive people.
So you arrived to do your fieldwork among the cognac Nagas. One of the first sites you saw were the megalithic monuments which stood in the Naga villages. Did this interest you?
It interested me, yes, because I had in Vienna, under the influence actually of Heine Gelden, who was very interested in megalithic cultures altogether, I had then taken an interest in the distribution of megalithic civilizations throughout Southeast Asia. But I must say, I had also been for a long then by that time in Malinowski's seminar, and so I had slightly changed my view in the sense that I realized that when you go first to any tribe for the first time, any population indeed, you have to try first to get the social system straight. And megalith, I think, from that point of view, would have been almost sort of a thrill, where I would not particularly take a very great interest. Quite apart from the fact that among the cognac Nagas, the erection of megalithic monuments are not as important as among, for instance, among the Angamis, where they have great feasts of merit, and the cognacs don't they? Cognacs really only put up stone monuments when they had brought in some head. They were headhunters, as all Nagas. But by the time I came there, the cognacs, let's say, didn't hunt heads anymore of those villages where I was. Later on, I had a good deal of experience of seeing heads on trees, among other Nagas.
I was going to ask you about that. But could I ask you about another institution which you came across? And I'm interested in your reference to Malinowski and his well-known interest in sexual behavior of savages, because one of the institutions you came across were the men's houses, or morungs as they were called, which you described as an institution much like the English public school. I was wondering if you could describe what a morung was and how it worked.
Well, a morung is a men's house or bachelor's hall, which is a kind of ritual center of a village. It is also a place where the unmarried young men, boys and young men, sleep, where some married men spend a good deal of their time, which is the center for village rituals and festivals. You refer to Malinowski's interest in sexual behavior. In the morungs, there was no sexual behavior of any kind, because that was banned to girls, to women altogether. But there were also girls' dormitories. And while the young men and boys went to the morung, the girls went to the girls' dormitories, and the young men could visit the girls in their dormitories. Indeed, the girls' dormitories were put up and constructed by those young men who were potential mates for the girls. So it's quite true that this is, in Naga culture, it's quite an important feature, the men's houses and those girls' dormitories. And of course, men's houses are very widespread among different tribes, not only among other Naga tribes. There is that well-known book, The Moria and the Gotul, by Verja Elvin, and he described the youth dormitories of the Moria Gonds in Basta. There are other Indian tribes too, like the Oraons or the Gadabars, the Bondos, who all have either men's houses or youth dormitories. So it is quite an important institution.
Yes, and you also found it, I believe, in Nepal, among the Gurungs, for example.
Among the Gurungs you have the Rodigar, which is, however, very different from the Naga men's. The Naga men's houses are also very important because they are the places where most of the wood carvings and sculptures, wooden sculptures are, because they are highly decorated and painted. So the men's house is really a center both for ritual activities and also artistic activities, because the other houses are not decorated. But in the men's houses there are figures of men and women and of elephants and tigers, and that was very sad when I returned to the Konyak Nagas 34 years later in 71. I found that most of the men's houses didn't exist anymore. Modernization had really done away with that.
Did you manage to take photographs of these carvings?
Yes, I did. And in my first book then about the Konyaks, which was not a proper anthropological monograph, but almost like a travel book, called The Naked Nagas. In that there are quite a number of photographs. I also actually collected some of the smaller sculptures, not taking them out of the men's houses, which I think would have been quite wrong even if one could have done that. But I got the same artist to carve for me. Some of them are in the Museum of Anthropology, Völkerkunde Museum in Vienna. A few, I think, are in Cambridge. So I did do some collecting. Later on, I must say, I found that to collect sufficiently to bring back museum collections takes too much time. And in the future, I did not really collect very much.
But on this first expedition you collected?
On that first expedition I collected quite a lot.
What objects apart from the...
Well, carvings, textiles, they are easy to collect and easy to transport, all sorts of small domestic implements, pots and pans and grass skirts and spears, and those
drums.
Small drums, and a few things which I had again. They have, for instance, those gongs, the Nagas, with a slit. So they are really xylophones. The proper term is a xylophone. And so I had one or two made miniature xylophones, but the big ones one would need a huge airplane to bring them back.
The main collection that you made is in Austria, is it?
The main, correct, because then I was based on Vienna still, and I had got some money from the Museum for Völkerkunde, so there's quite a substantial Naga collection in Vienna in the Ethnographic Museum.
But also some of your collections here in Cambridge?
Yes, there are a few pieces in Cambridge, and there are very few pieces in the Horniman Museum in London.
You said that when you went back, the Morums were falling into decay. You talk in your book on Return to the Naked Nagas about the influence of the Baptist missions in the Naga Hills. I was wondering whether they were behind some of this change in attitude.
They largely were. The Konyak Nagas as I knew them in 1936 and 37, had not been under any mission influence. And the interesting thing is that after the departure of the British officials and after the departure of the American Baptist missionaries, there were Nagas who then spread Christianity among tribes which had been untouched before. And the Konyak Nagas were one of those tribes. And I remember in the village called Wokching, where I had spent most of the time when I was first working there, the people told me, well, you know, since Christianity came in, we have given up many of our old rituals and festivities. But we aren't really Christians either, so now we are nothing. I mean, we have lost our old religion and we haven't adopted a new one.
It seems on the surface strange that a society which you describe as so happy, gay, cheerful, drinking their own form of alcohol, engaging in a very free and open sexual relationships and social relationships, should with such zeal take to a very ascetic form of Christianity. Do you have any ideas why they should have done this?
Well, actually, I must say they didn't. Namely, outwardly, they became Christians. And I think the main reason was at that time, by, for instance, the Konyaks, that Christianity was linked in their minds with education. There had been mission schools, the other tribes had literature, etc. Then these Naga missionaries, they came in and said, look, I mean, if you want to survive in the modern world, and in the world of modern Indian politics, you must become literate. And now we will bring literacy. And it's quite true that in all Nagas who are present in any government positions, they are all the products of mission schools. So those Nagas, those Konyaks who told me now we are nothing, we aren't Christians and we aren't the old, haven't got our old religion, they are those who certainly didn't take up Christianity with any particular conviction. See, they certainly didn't give up drinking rice beer, and I very much doubt whether their sexual morals have changed very much.
On their sexual morals, though one shouldn't go into it too much, one of the very striking features which must have struck you was the difference between the Western European Christian attitude towards premarital intercourse and the attitudes in this society. What was the main difference between their attitude and...
Well, the main difference was that among the Konyak Nagas, it was taken for granted that all the young boys and girls would have love affairs, and nobody objected to that. And then later on, after they had some period of premarital enjoyment, then they would marry. And on the whole, and that is not, I found, not only among Konyak Nagas, this is the same, for instance, among the Bastagond, described by Varya Elvin in this book on the youth dormitories, that where there is great freedom in before marriage among the young people, the marriages then are relatively stable. But I found that other Gonds, whom I had studied, we might come to that later on, where there is not very much premarital permissiveness. There the marriages are by no means stable, and their sort of flexibility comes in later, that people have a succession of marriages. So certainly one can't generalize, because in modern Western societies there is premarital permissiveness, but not necessarily marital stability. So you might have it both ways too.
During your field work, you suddenly received a message that J.P. Mills was going to go on a punitive expedition into an area in to the Patcoy Hills. Could you perhaps tell us about something about that mission?
Well, that was a great piece of luck for any anthropologist, I think, that I was allowed to accompany a district officer who was going on an expedition into areas where neither he nor any other British officer, not to talk of anthropologists, had ever been. It was a kind of punitive expedition, but not entirely. It was really an expedition into the unadministered tribal areas which lay between the administered Naga Hills district and the frontier of Burma, where headhunting was going on. And everybody knew that, and there was no intention to administer that area. But if people from that area raided into the administered parts of Naga Hills, then expeditions were undertaken. And in this particular case, there had been some raids on villages which were, although not administered, but they were somewhat friendly with the British administered Nagas. And some people had not only, many had been killed, but others had been captured and taken across the Burma border, because the Nagas on the other side of the borders were known to use also captives in war as for human sacrifice. Human sacrifice is a sort of alternative for headhunting. And the idea of Mills was to free some of those captives. He also succeeded, and he freed a few. Some of them were children. So the whole expedition had really the purpose of to establish that if they exceeded their sort of permitted limit of headhunting and made great raids on villages and killed just too many people and captured others, that the British government would take some steps. And that was quite successful, but it was marvelous for me, because for the first time I got into areas which had never been administered, which had never been even looked at, which were white spots on the map. And that is a sort of what an anthropologist really would like to do, to see a society which had not been influenced by outside administration at all.
This was an extremely dangerous mission. You went with 2.5 platoons of Assam rifles and 360 coolies, and you travelled off into the forest, which was filled with sharp pointed sticks to trap you, and with the possibility of people firing poisoned crossbow arrows at you. You must have been slightly apprehensive as you set off.
Well, I was a little apprehensive, but not very apprehensive, I must say. And I must say it was not quite as dangerous that later on the, what is now Arunachal Pradesh in then called Northeast Frontier Agency, I think I did trips which were a bit more dangerous than that. But because there, after all, we had at least some Assam rifle, that is this kind of police force recruited from Gurkhas, Nepalese Gurkhas. But we were actually attacked by several hundred of Nagas, and we had to run away. We ran a little faster than the Nagas, not because we could inherently run faster, but because our Assam rifle escort then managed to fire into the group of Nagas which were running after us, and that put them off. No, it was a little dangerous.
Because at one point you were running up a hill with 500 Nagas behind you.
Yes, that was that
50
occasion.
guns in front of you firing at the Nagas.
Yes, that was the occasion.
And they shot 5 of the Nagas, is that right?
They did. If they hadn't shot those 5 who were sort of in the front rank, I think you wouldn't be talking to me now, because I think they certainly, we were outnumbered to such an extent, probably 20 to 1, that we wouldn't have had any other chance.
So we're talking to you now, but what was the final result of the expedition? Did they destroy the villages, or?
The expedition was that those 2 villages which had refused to give up any of those captives and had taken the captives away with them, they were set on fire. Of course, that sounds worse than it is, because these houses are built of bamboo and thatch and so on. They can very easily be rebuilt. It's not like burning a village with solid houses. And in order to get them to see that government is really serious about pursuing their aim of getting these captives back. And we got them back. I mean, Mills got them back. So they were freed.
And from the poles in the village, you took off a basket full of heads, which no one would be prepared to carry, and therefore you had to carry them back yourself.
Yes, they had hung up in good Naga fashion the heads of their enemies, and they were not, fortunately, not absolutely fresh heads. I mean, they had still hair and skin on, but the hair and skin was dried and so on. And as I was then collecting for a museum, I wanted to have those head trophies, and I found a basket in one of the deserted houses, put them in. But then none of the Nagas who had come with us wanted to carry that basket, because they said, well, we carry heads which we have taken and so on, but we don't really know what the ritual position of those heads is, and it might be quite dangerous for us, so I had to carry those heads myself. Sorry.
As anthropological specimens, you decided, instead of taking them to the museum, to distribute them to the awaiting Nagas, and you witnessed what I think, as you described, must be an absolutely unique thing for an anthropologist ever to have seen, which are the headhunting ceremonies. Could you just very briefly describe?
Well, the Konyak Nagas, among whom I had been living for, by that time, about 7 months before I got on that trip, they were very excited, because they knew I was going with an armed force in an area where there were headhunters, there would be fighting, and they expected, of course, that we would possibly get some heads. They thought of heads which we would cut off, which we hadn't done. But when I brought back these dried heads, they had all been looking forward to fresh heads. They thought, well, dried heads are better than no heads. And they thought it would be possible to perform the ceremonies which are normally performed if a head is brought into a village by a member of that village. Now, I had lived long enough there, so they thought I could, for ritual purposes, be considered as being a member of the community and having brought those heads. And then they didn't ask very much how I got them, or whether I had actually killed the people or not. Heads were heads. So then the question is now, there were altogether, I think, 6 or 7 heads. Now, who would get those heads? Now, fortunately, it is not necessary for a ceremony to be performed to have a whole head. You can do it with parts. and also that because in the same way as if a real head is brought in, sometimes it is split up, and everybody who participated in the raid will have one part. And they were so keen on having performing these rites and having the head, because only those young men who had participated in the ritual of bringing in heads, enemy heads, were entitled to wear certain ornaments and also to have their face tattoo, which is necessary for a headhunter. And as they had lived under the Pax Britannica for several years already, they had not had a chance of taking heads themselves. So these substitute heads were very useful. So actually the ritual was done exactly as if they themselves had brought in enemy heads. And I could both photograph it, I could record it, I could record the various songs and whatever was being said, recorded. Fortunately, in those days it was in 1936, there were no tape recorders, so I had to write down there what they said. And rather amusingly, when 34 years later I went there again, and I saw some men who had face tattoos, middle-aged men. And I said, how did I think there's no more head hunting you have to do? They said, these are your heads. But actually, I think even now, I think the last recorded, confirmed type of head hunting, I think happened in something like 62 or 63, 1962, on the Assam-Burma border. And I think on the Burma side, where there is virtually no administration, I think headhunting probably still goes on.
What is the, very, very briefly, what is the function, so to speak, of headhunting? What do they see the virtue of headhunting?
Oh, the virtue is that they believe there are certain kind of magical forces in the human head. And the person who takes that head, brings it home to his village, this kind of magical virtue that is transferred to his village, and therefore the heads are put on shelves in the men's houses again, or chief's house, and they are kept there. And several times a year they are being fed with rice and rice beer, because in order to keep this magical force alive. So the idea is really that it is useful for the fertility of the village, the fertility of men and women and of cattle and of the fields, to have these heads. And that's the same, for the same reason, of course, human sacrifice has been performed. Among Nagas, human sacrifice was really a substitute for headhunting. Namely, it was, if you bought a slave and killed him, you could get all the prestige of a headhunter without risking your own life. But even now, you will always read about human sacrifice in the Indian press, because even now there are cases. I was recently in India and I saw one or two small reports of somebody being arrested because of having killed somebody in a Shiva temple or so on, because human sacrifice has certain advantages for getting, for instance, when a new tank is being built or a new bridge is being built, a kind of foundation sacrifice, and that has not completely disappeared from India now.
Well, perhaps we ought to move on, since we've talked a good deal. There's a great deal more about the Nagas, obviously, and your return to the Nagas, but fortunately some of this has been written up in your books. You went then from the Naga Hills to go and work in central India, but at a later point you returned to Assam, but not to the Nagas. Why did you return, and where did you return?
Well, that was really, again, lucky coincidence. I had, after doing my first 13 months of field work among the Nagas, I had come back to Austria. But I had felt that my work among the Nagas had not been completed. I wanted to have another period. So as soon as possible after this, I set out for India again with the intention of going to the Naga Hills. Actually, a fortnight after I arrived in India, the war broke out. So neither could I go to the Naga Hills, nor was it really possible to go what I didn't really want particularly, to go back to Vienna. Because by that time another raid had taken place, namely Hitler had occupied Austria, and consequently Austria was then part of Germany. I had by that time a German passport. And so when the war broke out in India, I was in the position of an enemy alien. But fortunately I had good connections, and so I was allowed to do anthropological work in the place where where I was when the war broke out, which was Hyderabad State. And I've then worked for quite a number of years in Hyderabad. In the fourth year of my stay there, I had then an offer from the government of India through my old friend Philip Mills, who by that time was no longer Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills, but was advisor to the governor of Assam. And this message from him offered me a post under the government of India as special officer and assistant political officer on the Northeast Frontier, which was then called NIFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, to do some exploration among the virtually unknown tribes which live in the mountains between Assam and Tibet. They had never been administered all through the British rule because there was no apparently need or advantage. But in the course of the war, when the Japanese occupied parts of Burma, it was felt that anything might happen in these northeastern mountains too, and therefore it would be advisable to at least find out what conditions were there. So 2 or 3 expeditions were sent into these areas, and in one section I was chosen to go in and do some, from the point of view of the government of India, just exploratory work from my own point of view, connected with that anthropological work. And I had there the great advantage of going into an area which was inhabited by several different tribes. The most interesting perhaps were the Apatanis. There were about 15,000 people living in one single valley, very densely populated, surrounded by quite different tribes, and to study a society which had never been administered by any outside power. And therefore, everything was as it had been probably for centuries. So I spent then, it was in 1944 and 45, until the end of the war, when that whole project was called off. I spent among Apatanis and then also neighboring tribes, and therefore I had said before that perhaps trips there were somewhat more dangerous than among the Nagas, because they were very warlike tribes, and if you were friendly with one and went to the other, you could possibly be attacked. It actually didn't happen. And so I worked there and also later on wrote some books about the Apatanis. And I tried in recent years to revisit all the various people I had met before. And it was particularly interesting among the Apatanis because they, in the meanwhile, had been administered by the Indian administration and had developed extraordinarily fast. They had schools, and consequently there were educated Apatanis. This was, again, I was there last in 1982, which was after all from 44, was nearly 40 years later. And I could see there the whole change which had taken place in a previously untouched society. But whereas in other parts of India, a change usually meant a kind of deprivation, namely that people lost their land to more advanced people, and their general standard of living and so deteriorated. It was not so among the Apatanis. They had greatly improved, if you may say so. The area had not been overrun by outsiders, and the Apatanis had sort of accomplished the transition to modernity and modern politics and all that very rapidly and very successfully. There are now Apatanis, members of the Legislative Assembly and other politicians, and many have university degrees and are members of government services, etc. So that was very interesting, this to see them in their original state and see them a long time afterwards.
Yes, we'll go on to talk about the problems of tribal people being in their contacts with the major civilization. I wanted to just go back though to your first arrival among the Apatanis. You said that this was more dangerous in many ways than the trip to the Nagas, but it seems to have been a partly self-imposed danger in that, against the advice of almost everyone, you set off unarmed without any escort, armed escort, because the government wanted you to take masses of Gurkhas with you. Also with your wife Betty, who before in your previous field work you hadn't been married, you had now married. So you took a white woman and yourself unarmed into these hills. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I decided to do that very much against great opposition on the part of the government of India, because they said nobody ever went into those hills unarmed. And we don't take any responsibility. If you want to take your wife with you, you must sign that it's on your own responsibility, etc. But I thought, if I go into an area which had no contact with the outside world, and I arrive with an escort of Gurkha soldiers, there is just no chance of establishing any kind of friendly relations. So you have to take a little risk. And to go in alone, unarmed, and also it's a great advantage to have your wife with you, because they think that people who go with their wife, they are probably have no hostile intentions, and they don't go there in order to make war on anybody, even if they have no arms. Apart from that, by that time, that was in 1944, we had about done field work in other parts of India, in Hyderabad state, together for a long time, so we didn't want to give up. And so it was for personal reasons as well as for reasons of really diplomacy, because that was made it possible to go to people who were quite, one might say, quite wild, in the sense that they had a lot of feuds among themselves, without getting very much involved.
You went to two areas where the people were, as you say, thought of by the plainsmen as extremely wild and ferocious, and yet in your books you describe them with great affection and warmth. How physically and mentally did you find the hill tribesmen of the Assam area?
Well, those people who were known as so ferocious, the people then known as dufflers, now they call themselves nishis, they were friendly to us, and they can be very charming to their friends, but they also can be very fierce to their enemies. And actually, they were probably the most, how shall I say, martial, most ferocious people I have been working with it. I mean, I think everybody, every adult man had been involved in raids, and many of them had themselves been captured and then held to ransom. So it was a society, a bit like the Pathans on the northwest frontier, who were continuous in a kind of process of feuds, revenge killings, and then periods of peace, and again a raid or a feud. And that seemed to me so interesting, to study a society where there didn't seem to be any kind of local authority. I mean, there were no headmen, there was no village council. Everybody was really a law to himself, and also who had to look after himself. I mean, if somebody had a grievance, there was nobody he could appeal. There were no legal sanctions. I mean, if you killed somebody, that man had no redress except that, I mean, the family had no redress, that his brothers or sons and so might then kill someone of your side. So this was really the possibility of seeing how does a society with apparently no authority system can really function. Well, it does function.
In this, they were very different in their temperament from the Apatanis.
Yes, they were very different, because the Apatanis, they lived in a very complex area. They had large villages up to 800, 1,000 houses. So they couldn't have that society couldn't have worked without some kind of local system of authority and administration. While the Nishis, they lived in dispersed settlements, so it was not so essential to have a very close control over people's actions. Although the Patanis were wet rice cultivators, they had a complicated system of irrigation, and that too needed some cooperation, control, etc.
Though they had a complex economy, as you said, they were technologically a very simple society, in that they were really pre-wheel and largely pre-plough cultivators when you first went, weren't they?
I think the Apatanis must have been, until 30 years ago, very much comparable to a Neolithic civilization. Namely, they had a fairly developed agriculture, irrigation and careful control of their resources. They had not only rice fields, but groves of fruit trees and pine trees, etc.